Hello. All right. So I think we've got critical mass. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the second in our series on data and mapping for environmental justice. And today I'm going to be presenting. My name's Edmund Cito, and I'm a professor, and I'm affiliated with the Center for Environmental Health Equity at the University of Washington. And the topic of my presentation today will be exploring the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CEJST. But before I get started, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues on the outreach team to say a few words about our center.
Awesome. And do you want me to share my screen, Edmund, or do you want to share your screen?
Um, well, I thought I was sharing screen, so thanks for the
Not
reminder.
quite.
Okay, how about now?
It looks great.
Okay.
If you want to go to the second slide, I'll introduce myself and then bring in my colleague, Allison. So my name is Leah Wood. I think I've had the joy of meeting a lot of people on this call already. I am the Community Outreach Manager for the University of Washington for Center for Environmental Health Equity, or CEHE. Allison, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I am Allison Hirata, and I'm the Tribal Outreach Manager for CEHE. And I'm a descendant of the Kurdic tribe, and I've been working with and for tribal communities and governments for several years. Um, and then, would you like me to do the menu of services right now, Leah, or pass it back to you to do a little bit more?
Let me give
Um,
an overview of CEHE first, and
yeah.
then we'll move into it. Um, so for those of you who haven't worked with our center yet, CEHE is one of, I believe it's either 16 or 17 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, or TICTACs, which might be the cutest acronym in the federal government. These are our EPA and DOE funded technical assistance centers intended to support community-based organizations and tribes when it comes to developing projects and accessing funding related to environmental and energy justice. So we've been around for a little over a year. We are one of two centers serving the states of Washington, Alaska, Idaho, and Oregon. And we provide free technical assistance services kind of along the spectrum of getting a project off the ground. And so I'll pass it to Allison to go over our menu.
So, technical assistance that we offer on our menu of services, and I always like to include that this menu is free of charge. We have some folks understandably ask, what does this cost? Do these services cost anything? And the answer is no, they are free. So, I always just like to clarify that. And it's not limited to this list. This list is just to illustrate several things that we do, but we always encourage groups to reach out to us if they have a specific thing in mind that they don't see on the menu. And we're always happy to have a conversation and see what ways we can meet you where you're at. But a few things that we do, facilitation. This includes workshops, and that can be workshops that we host on topics that are relevant to the community-based organizations and tribes that we work with. It can also include if a group wants help formulating a workshop for their community. We can provide technical assistance in the form of being thought partners and co-planners in that. Collaboration support. Some groups would like help with connecting with other groups, partnering with other groups, and so we can act as a kind of a connection point if folks are looking for different communities to collaborate and work with in their environmental justice efforts. And then planning support, again, community-based organizations and tribes have a lot of planning to do, and so this can look a host of different ways, but just helping with different aspects of planning, and whether that's for funding purposes or just for strategic planning within an organization. Developing ideas for a project. We work with a lot of organizations and some tribes that have really incredible ideas and visions, and they will seek us out for help just articulating and providing some structure to those project ideas and those really great visions that they have. Administrative and finance support. So this could look like pre or post award management. Something unique that we have to offer that not every TICTAC does, being based out of a university, we can provide literature review and data synthesis. And we work with a group of wonderful graduate students that can do a lot of this work or help us do this work. And so we've created things like fact sheets and handouts for different community organizations and their events. And also things like educational social media posts, compiling information for that. Content expertise. So this can look like if a group is wanting more information on air quality management or how to monitor air quality, we can provide information on ways to do that and the literature to back that up. And then finally, funding and proposal management and development. And this is a big portion of what we do. A lot of groups are obviously trying to locate funding and they want help applying for that funding. And so we can provide support in that area of both locating and applying for funding. We cannot write grants, but we can do peer review for grants. And a lot of groups find that very helpful. So again, this is just an overview of what we can offer. It's not the end all be all, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of what we can do. So feel free to check out our website. You can scan that QR code and feel free to reach out to us as well. And I will pass it back to Leah or pass it over to Edmund.
Okay,
I think you can
I'll
take it
take
from here,
over.
Edmund.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll mention we have turned on recording. This is a second webinar, and we actually have a recording of our previous webinar on the use of EJ Screen, another mapping tool. And so we'll be recording this, and after it's available, it'll also be on our website, which is listed here. Okay, so for today, I mentioned we're going to be talking about CEJST, or the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. This is a tool that was developed fairly recently, around 2021, that time frame. It's developed by the Council for Environmental Quality, or the CEQ. The CEQ is it's a presidential executive office that coordinates a bunch of efforts by federal agencies, particularly around environmental issues. And it was established, this tool was established largely to implement the Justice 40 initiative. The tool, it's an interactive map. There's a website for it. And it really collates a variety of different data sets that our environmental justice leaders within our nation had selected as being really relevant to the lived experiences of community members throughout the nation. Um, it organizes burdens into 8 categories, which I'll describe later. But there's some key features about the CEJS tool. Mainly that it helps to highlight those communities that are highly impacted. They define these communities as disadvantaged because they're overburdened by different types of legacy pollutants, current pollutants, poor social economic conditions, and they're underserved communities. And under the Justice 40 initiative, the federal government seeks to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of investments in a number of different funding programs, funding related to climate, clean energy, and other environmental related improvement areas to these disadvantaged communities. And so this map has some very important roles in terms of prioritizing communities for these very important Justice 40 funding initiatives. I should mention, this is a living map. so to speak, in the sense that um, the data that goes into the current version of the map is intended to be updated over time. And so it's as I mentioned earlier, it's developed by the CEQ, but there's a whole process behind its development. The CEQ sought advice from the WEJAC, or the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, on the development of the tool. There was also tribal consultation, and so tribal nations also had input into the development of the tool, and it helped shape some of the way that tribal communities and folks living on tribal lands are considered in terms of disadvantaged communities. The CEQ plans to update this tool every year, and the updates are based on a combination of public feedback, research, and updating of data as new versions of data become available. So I mentioned that the data that's included within the CEJST tool are organized in terms of categories of burden. And I've listed that here. There's 8 categories of burden. They cover things like climate change, energy, housing issues, all the way to workforce development issues. And in terms of the spatial coverage or the geographic coverage of the map, it not only covers the continental United States, but it covers Alaska, Hawaii, District of Columbia, and also the US territories as well. Within each of the categories, each of these 8 categories, there's actually some underlying additional data indicators that go into them. And I've showed some examples in the bubbles to the right here in blue. And so you could see that within the climate change burden category, there actually are a handful of different data indicators, everything from consideration of flood risk to wildfire risk, to agricultural loss and so forth. And what's interesting is that they use a bit of map logic. And so it's not enough for a community to lie within a projected flood risk area, but that community also needs to be a low-income community in order to be designated as a disadvantaged community. And you see the same thing for health burden. For the health burden category, you can see that there are a handful of different data indicators, things like the asthma rates within the community, how much diabetes is prevalent within the community, and so forth. But again, it's not sufficient for these communities to have poor health conditions. They have to have poor health conditions as well as be low-income communities in order to be designated as disadvantaged. So, and many of the burden categories are structured this way, in which income is considered. I should also mention that in terms of the availability of the data that's shown on the map, it's organized at the census tract level. And so it's not the finest spatially resolved data. Particularly for rural areas, there are some challenges. But in terms of the data availability, the CEQ decided that most of the available federal data could be organized at the tract level. And the tool also is very explicit about land that's within the boundaries of federally recognized tribes and the point locations of Alaska Native villages. And so as you interact with the online mapping tool, you'll see these areas show up. And with tribal consultation, it was decided that these tribal lands by default or automatically fall within the highly impacted disadvantaged community designation. So what can you do with the CEJST tool? One major thing that you could do is figure out whether or not your community has environmental justice concerns, whether or not your community is designated as highly impacted or disadvantaged. Another role that the CGIST map plays increasingly is as a tool to support grant applications. We're finding more often than not, a lot of federal opportunities are asking for communities to look up their locations within on the mapping tool and to see whether or not the projects and programs that you're proposing actually fall within within the CGIST identified disadvantaged communities. And I think generally under Justice 40 initiative, the tool serves a very important role in terms of informing ongoing policy and project planning, and really focusing on area specific programs. So as an example of some of those federal funding opportunities that are looking at disadvantaged communities, currently there's a call out right now for the EPA Grant Makers Program. And under the EPA Grant Makers Program, you could see there's a call for a variety different types of projects, type 1 projects, type 2 projects, and type 3 projects. And I thought it was interesting to kind of bring up some of the evaluation criteria that they mentioned that their reviews of different proposals would consider. And you can see here that under funding priorities, they're awarding points in their reviews for programs that support Justice 40 defined communities. And so that to me sounds like if you're interested in applying for an EPA Grant Makers Program, you should probably be looking up your community on the CGIST mapping tools and seeing what aspects of the map are highlighted that you could integrate within your proposals for the EPA Grant Makers Program. So I thought it might be nice to just do kind of a demo of the CGIST tool, explore how we might use it. In this case, I chose the Yakima Valley in Washington State as a community that we might kind of zoom into and explore what the CGIST tool says about environmental priorities for this area. If how we could use the tool to identify those communities that might be designated as disadvantaged, and also see what the tool says about certain burden categories as well as those data indicators that underlie the categories. So with that, I can run through a set of slides. First off, to access the CGIST tool, it's online at this website link. I can never remember this exact website link, and so I simply Google CGIST whenever I need to reach this website. And you'll see you'll reach this CGIST Explore the Map website. This is the front page of the website. And it looks kind of like a Google Maps interface, which many of us are probably familiar with. I wanted to highlight that there are some limited multilingual capabilities. You can access this tool in English and in Spanish by clicking on the upper right corner of the website. So in terms of getting around the mapping interface, they have a few different tools that you could use. You can see there's some zoom in and out tools. You can, click on Alaska or Hawaii or some of the territories and zoom directly into those locations. Or they have a search bar. And so you could put in a specific address, a city, state, or zip code, or click on the little bullseye target to kind of zoom into where you're currently located. And then the other aspect of their interface is over to the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, there's a window that sort of changes as you kind of interact with the map. And so currently, when you bring up the map, all it shows is a set of notes. But the notes are actually kind of useful to decipher what's actually being shown on the map. So the first thing it mentions is that, what you're seeing, these different polygon areas, are actually census tracts. And so as you kind of zoom into different areas and you see these polygons change and highlight based on the different designations, know that you're looking at census tracts, which usually there are areas that account for about 2,000 to 8,000 people. The other thing you'll notice is that there's areas that are shaded in blue on the map, and these represent those areas that are designated as disadvantaged communities based on the underlying data on the map. Okay, so let's find Yakima. So if I enter Yakima, Washington, it'll zoom into Yakima City. And that's what happens when you hit the search bar. It'll zoom into Yakima. And what I thought might be interesting is if we zoom maybe out a little bit and take a look at the Yakima Valley as a whole. And you can notice some different things. First off, we can notice some areas are in fact shaded blue, and these represent the areas of the valley that have been designated as disadvantaged. The other interesting thing you can notice is that the Yakima Indian Reservation is shaded in a darker shade of blue. And that's because lands that are within the boundaries of federally recognized tribes are in this darker blue shaded color. And so once again, these federally recognized tribal lands are inherently designated as disadvantaged areas. So what I've done here is I've zoomed in a little bit into the valley area, and I've used my mouse to click on one census tract. And this happens to be the census tract for Granger. And even before clicking on it, I could see in the map that it was this light shade of blue, which indicates that it's been identified as a disadvantaged area. But we can use the pane, the window on the right, to learn a little bit more about this community. The data, see the data that is actually within the CEJST tool. And so on the upper right of the window, you could see some information about the tract, like its population. And then there's two pull down boxes to look at race, ethnicity, and age demographics. And so if you expand those, you get some information about the demographics for this area, and both in terms of age and race, ethnicity. And then right immediately below those demographics, you can see very clearly, is this area identified as disadvantaged, yes or no? And in this case, it's yes. And it explains why. It's because this particular selected tract has at least one burden threshold that's exceeded. And the other thing we can note is as you scroll down and look below the tract designation, is you can actually see the highlights of those 8 different burden categories. And so in this case, we could see that amongst the different categories, there are some that are shaded in dark blue, which means that those categories are exceeded. They have thresholds that are exceeded. So in this case, we could see housing, transportation, workforce development are all categories that have thresholds that have been exceeded. And we can learn a little bit more. So if we expand any given category, we could see those underlying data indicators. And so we can see for housing, this they account for housing cost, green space, presence of indoor plumbing, lead paint. And you could see that low income has to be a factor in order for any of those other data indicators to be relevant. And so in this case, we find that this census tract has relatively high low-income populations living there. But we also see that lack of green space in this area is a contributing factor for why the housing burden category is exceeded. And similarly, if we scroll down to a different category, in this case, I've selected workforce development, we can see once again that there are a few data indicators that are responsible for why this burden category is exceeded. Linguistic isolation, the relatively large number of households where no one over the age of 14 speaks English very well is somewhat high, and so that exceeds a threshold there. But also high school educational attainment is relatively low, and so that is a contributing factor for why workforce development is a challenge for this particular selected tract. So with all maps, it's important to kind of think about the data that's in these tools, but also kind of the data that aren't, and what the limitations are, especially for nationwide mapping tools. One thing to note is the S within the CEJST acronym does stand for screening. And so it's a screening level tool. And it doesn't have super detailed data, and it doesn't have all the data. And so, but really it gives us some initial insights into the situations within census tracts across the US. The other thing to note is that they have been very intentional about including a certain set of indicators that speak to a certain set of climate and economic justice categories. And so, thinking about its use as an overall environmental justice tool, it may not have everything that we're interested in, and certainly not everything that would speak to the environmental justice issues in every single community across the U.S. So the data are proxies for exposures and risk that might exist within communities across the nation, but certainly they don't include everything. One interesting thing that they mention on the CEJS website is that in addition to having this nationwide tool, they acknowledge that there are a number of state and region-specific mapping tools. And there could be some differences between what you see on the CEJS tool versus what you may see in some of the state or regional mapping tools. CEJS has been very intentional about including data that are mostly available nationwide. There are some indicators that they specifically point out that they include on their map that aren't necessarily available nationwide. Particularly under the housing burden category, they note that historically underinvested communities that have had historic underinvestment, redlined areas, are only available for those areas that have been that have the redlining maps. That's an example of one data set that it's a nationwide data set, but it's not available everywhere. And then I mentioned earlier, census tracts are the primary units of analysis, and sometimes communities cross census tracts. Census tracts tend to be very large for rural and remote communities, and so that can be a limitation with this and other maps. And the other thing is this is not meant to be a regulation tool. It's more of a prioritization tool, which has very important uses within the Justice 40 program. And on the CEJST website, they had this quote, which I thought was really important for all of us to remember, is that not all disadvantaged communities can be shown on the map. And so my read of that is that local knowledge and community narratives are certainly very important to understanding disadvantaged communities, regardless of what's on the maps. Okay, so I hope this quick demo and quick description of the CGIS tool is helpful. If you have any questions, we can open it up for some Q&A. But I did want to leave you with some links specifically to some resources on the CGIS website. In particular, I noticed if you go to the CGIS website's About page, you'll see some additional tutorials on how to use the mapping tool, how to use the data. And particularly, if you are interested in doing some exploration yourself with the underlying data, they do make the data available publicly. So the data are downloadable via the CGIS website. And then the other thing I'll mention too is this comment about the CEQ continually wanting to update the map. And so they do have some feedback forms on their website where they are looking for community feedback. This is version 1 of the CGIS map. And so hopefully with very good engagement from community users of the CGIS tool, they'll be working on a much improved version 2. So at this point, we have a few more slides, but I'd be happy to open it up for questions. I think we've got a meeting chat, but we could also I think we could also use the raise hand feature and go off mute if that's useful too.
Edmund, if maybe while folks think about questions, I have a question that we can ask. So, for example, for those of us in Washington State, we have the environmental health disparities map. When would someone use the CGIS tool compared to the environmental health disparities map? And like, what should they think about when thinking about which tool to use?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks, Leah. As I mentioned, we're finding more often than not, a lot of different funding opportunities are explicitly referring people to mapping tools. And so in the case of federal funding opportunities from some of the federal agencies, we're finding explicit mention of federally designated under Justice 40 initiative disadvantaged communities. That's a strong hint to be using the CGIS map. In some cases, we found EPA opportunities. They refer people to EJ Screen, and so that's why our previous webinar we covered the EJ Screen maps. So I think pay attention to kind of eligibility criteria for different funding opportunities and the tools that they recommend. It may be that for Washington State funding opportunities, they're going to be directing you to look at the Washington environmental health disparities map and perhaps less so to the federal maps.
Awesome, thank you. That was super helpful. And we do have a question in the chat. Do you anticipate substantial changes for CEJST to exist after the new administration is inaugurated?
It's hard to say. We're in a period of transition and uncertainty. Um, I will mention that, a number of different important environmental committees have kind of persisted throughout the changing administrations, and certainly our federal agencies that are collecting and contributing data into tools like CGIST um, are continuing to develop these data sets. And so the underlying data, I think, will certainly be relevant. And as those data sets are updated, it's my hope that there'll be ongoing development of CGIST. So, like I said, there's some uncertainty, but I think, yeah, we're expecting a lot of this work to continue.
So we have another question in the chat. Thank you. Are there significant differences between the EJ Screen tool and CGIST?
There are. There's methodological differences, uh, uh, as well as conceptual differences, as well as data differences. So a lot of differences, and let me kind of run through them. So conceptually, the CGIST, the scope of CGIST is perhaps a bit broader than EPA's EJ Screen tool. And so if you think about EPA developing the EJ Screen tool, their primary mandate is sort of environmental conditions. Whereas if you look at CGIST and their burden categories, they cover things that might overlap with FEMA, might overlap with CDC, might overlap with commerce and economic development issues, and so forth. So I think, conceptually, the areas that they're trying to cover with their mapping indicators are slightly different. And then in terms of methodology, there are also some differences. And so as I showed earlier in the demo, CGIST has this way of doing relatively simple map logic, where if you exceed a threshold in any given category, um, that sets you up to be designated as a disadvantaged community. So there's an actual threshold and a designation. EJ Screen is largely a tool to help characterize potential risk from a screening level perspective. And so those thresholds aren't so clearly described within EJ Screen type analyses. I think in recent versions of the EJ Screen tool, they've integrated the federal designations, but the original genesis of the EJ Screen was more of kind of like um, a risk characterization tool. And there are some differences in data too. And so EPA provides, for instance, air pollution data for the CGIS tool, but the air pollution data that they provide in EJ Screen is slightly different than the air pollution data that are incorporated into CGIST for whatever reason. So it's important to kind of dig into those details if you're interested in why one tool may be slightly different than the other.
Thanks, Edmund. So the next question, in case folks are listening, I'm reading them out loud if they can't see their screens. What type of grants have you provided support for in the past? And so I'm guessing this is referring to our whole center. Is that right? So maybe, do you want to speak to some of the areas we've supported folks? Oh, thank you. Correct.
Yeah, so I can speak to this. Yeah, so our center is funded by the US EPA and also in part by the US Department of Energy. And so we are primarily assisting groups with grant opportunities that are kind of, covered within the environmental and energy justice space. Um, in the past, they've spanned from, federal funding opportunities from these agencies. For instance, we've recently have helped some groups that are thinking about community change grants. It's an EPA program. Um, but we've also worked with groups that are interested in applying to um, city and state funding opportunities. So it really is, based around kind of what community groups have identified as kind of interesting funding opportunities that would support their work. And in some cases, it's involved helping groups kind of think about doing these mapping analyses and figuring out whether or not their communities and their projects are eligible by looking up the locations of their projects on these maps. Um, in other cases, we've supported groups by helping to kind of discuss their ideas with them and look for opportunities to kind of refine their ideas. And so we're always happy to do that. And I should mention our priority audience for many of our services tend to be tribal organizations and federally recognized tribes, as well as community-based organizations. And so that keeps us quite busy.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but maybe while we give folks another couple minutes to think, do you want to share a little bit about where people can learn more or like access more information or reach out for help if, for example, they wanted to spend some time with the CEJST tool or even just think about some of these other areas that we can support?
Yeah. So as I said, these slides will be this presentation as a whole will be recorded and we'll post it on our website here later. And so I encourage you to kind of replay the presentation if you're interested in exploring the CGIS tool yourself. If after kind of exploring it yourself, you have some questions about your analyses for your community and you want to sort of brainstorm your use of the maps and also work with us on kind of looking up your community and exploring some things, we're happy to do that with you as well. And so email is a good way to reach out to us. And so our email address here is listed cehe@uw.edu. And so, yeah, if you let us know kind of which mapping tools you're using and kind of what you're hoping to achieve by looking up your community on the maps. Is it for a particular funding opportunity, or is it, trying to kind of help identify priorities that would fit kind of your programs and initiatives? All of the above, we would be happy to discuss those with you. Yeah, I think that's basically what I would like to say. And uh, yeah, as others have asked about earlier in the chat, I think we are kind of in a sort of exciting time where exciting, but also perhaps challenging and confusing time where there are multiple mapping tools that are out there. And so, the CGIST is one federal tool, but CDC has their own, ATSDR has their own, FEMA has their own. So there's a lot of different federal agencies even with all the coordination that's happening, you know, the different federal agencies have different maps for different purposes. So, yeah.
Not seeing any other questions. I'll follow up a little bit of what Edmund just said. So when you reach out to CEJST, whether it be by email or by phone, or you can also submit a web form on our website, that usually goes to myself or to Allison, so you can expect to hear directly from one of us within about a week at the latest. So just so you know what happens when you send an email, we are the people who are receiving it and we'll be responding.
Okay. So time is getting short and I'm not seeing questions. So I did want to mention that we anticipate, continuing with our webinars. They won't always be on mapping topics, and we're actually starting to make plans for future webinar series. And so at this point, we don't have anything on the books for our next webinar, but I can say certainly stay tuned. We'll reach out to you all once we have a topic for our next webinar. And certainly feel free to reach out to us with suggestions um, for things that you think might be helpful for your community and your work. As we plan out our schedule for future webinars, we'll certainly take your suggestions into account.